Today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about our new part system that we're using to evaluate defense. And it's called part. We're splitting it between positioning, airballs, range, and throwing. So I'm going to dive into that. But before I do, I guess I might as well give a kind of refresher on how the existing public-facing system works. So it's gone through a few name changes over the years. It's originally called the plus-minus system. And then it was renamed to the range and positioning system. But no matter what it's called, it's always served as the primary DRS component. Most of a player's contributions towards his DRS is made up from this specific component. The way it works, it relies on batted ball type, location, velocity, all this data collected by the video scouts at Baseball Info Solutions. And then when you want to evaluate a specific play, you can use those batted ball characteristics and split those batted balls into buckets, essentially. So you take a ball that's hit 10 degrees off the third base line, hit it 50 miles an hour or whatever. You can put that in a bucket by itself and then compare it to batted balls that had similar characteristics. And then you can calculate credit appropriately based on how often those other kinds of balls in play turned into outs. So as a quick example, ball hit into the third base shortstop hole at 70 miles an hour. We can take those characteristics, put it in its bucket, and see that similar batted balls were made into an out 60% of the time. And so if we say if the fielder made the play, he gets 0.4 plays of credit, and if he didn't make it, he gets minus 0.6 plays of credit. And that's using the ball and play out, and then we'll later convert that into a run value. So the advantage of this system, obviously, it's a little more advanced than something like fielding percentage. So I'll go through these 4 points. The first one is that credit is proportional to the difficulty. So as I kind of went through in the example, we can say it was a 60% play rather than just using some kind of binary outcome like a put out, assist, or error. So it helps to more appropriately reward fielders for the difficulty of the play they made. It naturally centers, so because we're using all the batted balls that we're comparing against to create the basis, everything is going to add up to 0. The sum of the out ratios are going to equal the sum of the outs. So an average fielder will be at 0 plays saved, and then we'll have guys above average will have positive plays saved, below will be below 0, and then all of the sum at each position will also add to 0. So it also captures multiple facets of defense, unlike something I'm going to compare to fielding percentage, where it's looking at just errors. So if some guy didn't get to the ball, he won't be punished using fielding percentage. In this way, we can look at all kinds of different factors and evaluate them in the system. And it's objective. Again, there's no official scorer who's deciding whether it was a hit or an error. It's the video scouts plot what happened, and then the algorithm will go through and be completely objective about it, and there's no input, essentially, from us or anyone else. So obviously there are limitations as well to the existing system, otherwise I wouldn't be up here. So I mentioned that it evaluates a lot of the many components of defense, and it does do that, but unfortunately the way it works right now is that they're all combined together, so you can't separate out a fielder's range from his positioning from his throwing or anything like that, and that's something we wanted to address in the new system. And the other limitation in the system was that shift plays were not included currently. Oh, sorry. So what happened is back in 2012, we noticed that Brett Laurie was getting a lot of credit for the plays he was making, and it turned out he was playing a lot of the times in short right field, where not a lot of other third basemen were making plays, and he was getting incredible range totals, essentially, because no other third baseman was making those plays in right field. So because that was also around the time where shifts were getting a lot more prevalent, they were throwing off the bases that were used for the calculations. So we took them out of the system in order to keep it accurate. So essentially how that system works, we calculate an out ratio. We can call it A, and then we have D, which is the ball and play result. We take D minus A to get the player's contribution. And so if the play was made, it's 1 minus the out ratio. If the play was not made, it is 0 minus the out ratio. And so what we're doing in the new system is very similar. It's using the same methodology, but in addition to these 2 points, we're adding 2 additional midpoints, which we're calling essentially B and C. So A is going to be the same as it always was, where it's calculating out ratios based on just the batted ball data. Then we have out ratio B, which is going to use those same characteristics, but also include infielder starting positioning data that's collected by the video scouts at Baseball Info Solutions. And then we can isolate that out effectively in order to separate out positioning. Then we have out ratio C, which is after the ball is fielded, we calculate the likelihood that it'll be turned into an out based on things like distance to the bag and batter speed and stuff like that. And then D is also the same, where it's 1 or 0 depending on whether the play was made. And like I said, using the differences between those out ratios, we can calculate each of the different components that goes into a fielder's range and positioning and throwing, essentially. So because B and A are using the same components except for just the infielder positioning one, if we take out the difference between them, we're isolating positioning on its own to get just how much he increased his likelihood on the play or decreased his likelihood on the play to make the out based on where he started. Range is going to be C minus B. So we take the probability that he would make the play after he fielded the ball and subtract out the probability he was going to make the play before he fielded the ball. And so we can see how quickly he got there or how effectively his route was or anything like that. And then throwing play saved, I guess you take out ratio C, which is after he fields the ball, and you do the D minus C to get that. So I'll just talk a little about the exact components that go into each of those out ratios. So for out ratio A, there's 5 of them. The first one is batted ball type. So this is specifically for the infield right now. This does differ slightly from what the public-facing system does right now in that that one separates ground balls from everything else. So we evaluate ground balls in one system and air balls, as we call them, in everything else. Here, we'll use ground balls and short line drives. Will somewhat be grouped together. We'll obviously still make the distinction, but they'll both be evaluated in this system as opposed to short line drives being evaluated as part of the airball system. Then we'll use batted ball velocity, which is collected using the timer data that the scouts are measuring batted balls with. Horizontal length, horizontal vector or spray angle, self-explanatory, I think. Batter speed, where we're just seeing where obviously faster guys are going to beat out more hits, so we wanted to group that together into a bucket. And then distance on those short line drives. So all grounders will be measured the same distance, but then short line drives will we'll split it into buckets based on how far they actually landed. So that's out ratio A. And then as I'll show you in a second, we have out ratio B is going to be a lot of the same components. 4 of them are exactly the same, in fact. And the only difference is that middle one, where instead of using the spray angle, we're using the vector difference between the fielder and the ball. And so in that way, we can, like I said, isolate out how much he increased or decreased his likelihood of making the play based on where he was standing. And that helps us to filter out the positioning component, which is important because sometimes you only want to know how rangy he is, or you maybe do want to know how well the team was positioning, and this lets you do that. And then out ratio C, like I said, we're calculating it after the ball was fielded. So we have how far away he was from the bag, where we're making an adjustment based on where the easiest play is for him. So this is not always to first base. We calculate the time to throw using our Baseball Info Solutions also collects home to first times for every player on their max effort plays. So we can use those to see how long he likely has to throw to first base before the runner is safe. And so if Billy Hamilton's obviously going to reach first base half a second faster than Albert Pujols, we're going to reward the fielder a lot more for making that play on Hamilton rather than someone like Pujols. And then there's also we include whether or not there was a deflection on the play, because that's going to change the difficulty of how likely it was to be turned into an out. So that's how we handle the ground balls and short line drives, but we called it part. There's also the A stands for airballs. We include those as well. So BIS right now only tracks infielder positioning on the ground balls and short line drives. We don't have that positioning data on the other ball and play types. So what we do is we're using StatCast positioning data for that right now, which is kind of why this system is was developed for team clients originally, and it's going to be private. It's not going to be public facing, but so we're able to use that StatCast positioning data in doing so and separating out range and positioning. So more on that. We're using, like I said, this is all a similar methodology, except this time there's only the one midpoint. It's going to be A, B, and D, where we can take B minus A to get positioning. and we can take D minus B to get the airplay saved, which it'll be called airplay save for infielders, but then for outfielders, we'll do the same thing, but we'll call it range play save for them. So essentially, like I said, we're doing that same process where we calculate those two different out ratios, calculating out ratio A, which is position independent, and out ratio B, which is position dependent, and then we take the difference to get positioning, and then use out ratio B and the ball and play result to get the range. And this is obviously more necessary as teams begin shifting their outfielders more and using some different alignments. I believe Neil mentioned yesterday the A.J. Pollock play where he was standing in right center field. I don't know if you can see that, but I tried to circle it to make it a little more obvious where he's standing. So when he made that play, no other center fielder is making that play, and it's in the existing system. It's hard to know whether it was due to his range or positioning, and here we can say that we know it was 99% positioning on that play, which helps us to evaluate players with a lot more accuracy. So now I'll get into, that's the basic methodology of how everything's going on. I don't want to get too into the weeds. There are some more subtleties that go behind the scenes, but I only have a limited amount of time. So I'm going to get to some of the results that you'll see. I'll get into some leaderboards and stuff like that, but a few notes before I get there. So like I said, this was developed for team clients, so it's not public-facing at the moment. It won't match what you see on Fangraphs or Baseball Reference or elsewhere because it includes that StatCast data, and we can't use it publicly. But I mean, the infield stuff, we do use our own data, so it's possible at some point it'll be released to the public, but at the moment, it's not. And then the other note to mention is that positioning run saved, we do calculate it out. We do record it for each player, but when we're doing when we're aggregating his components to get his run save total, we don't include positioning. We kind of came to the conclusion that teams and coaches have more of a hand in the decision-making process as to where the player stands, especially in the infield with all the shifts going on. So we aggregate that on a team level, but each individual fielder's positioning run saved won't count towards his individual DRS. So the infielders, it'll be air, range, and throwing will be the components of his part run saved, and outfielders, it'll just be range. And this is an example of that. I picked two center fielders who were kind of different in 2017. So Lorenzo Cain was the best center fielder in terms of range, actually, with 25 range runs saved, and Adam Jones was at minus 16 with that. But then both of them had the opposite in their positioning. So Lorenzo Cain was negative, and Adam Jones was positive. And it just kind of show you the breakdowns we can make with this new data that we have now. So the first leaderboard, I guess, shortstops are probably the most interesting one. So I'll start there. And you can see I've kind of offset the positioning column to show you that it's not being included in that ART total. It's just the air, range, and throwing. But the positioning, like I said, we do calculate it, and then we aggregate it on a team level. So the ART run saved will be the sum of those other three columns. And there might be some rounding errors, so don't hold me to those numbers. But they will add up in the database. So I mean, the most obvious thing that stands out here is Andrelton Simmons' range run saved, 28 in 2017. Which is just an enormous number. And everyone knows Andrelton Simmons is one of the best defenders out there. So it's not too surprising, but the magnitude that he's better than everyone else, at least in range, is pretty amazing. And he's also been one of the best throwers in other years. In this year, he was only 2 runs above average in that category. Although Elvis Andrus was 8 runs with his throwing, which made up a large component of his ART run saved, which is kind of unusual. Usually range is going to be the biggest part of that, but Elvis Andrus, like I said, was significantly better with his throwing, and this kind of breakdown now lets us know that, which is very useful, especially when evaluating players. And then the other point I want to make is Addison Russell. So he's obviously also one of the best defending shortstops out there, and he was 4th in this leaderboard. But he actually also had 7 positioning runs saved, which is better than anyone else here. So if you added that back in, he would be at 17, but we wanted to reward him for what he did, not for how the Cubs were positioning him. And I mean, the Cubs are very good at positioning their infielders, but so we isolate that for the Cubs. But for him, he was still obviously one of the best guys out there. So I'll just go through the other positions. We have second base. None of these names should be too surprising because the system's working in largely the same way as it's worked in the past. Most of the names are going to be familiar. So Kinsler, Scope, LeMahieu, Pedroia are all guys who are currently atop the leaderboard in the other system as well. Third baseman, Longoria might be a little surprising at the top. He's always been a good defender, but being ahead of Chapman and Arenado was kind of surprising to us at least, although the other guys on that list are also usual mainstays when talking about the top defensive third baseman. And then first base, again, a lot of usual names. Goldschmidt's also near the top. I think he was at 7 runs saved. But yeah, it's, like I said, the system should look very similar because it's using similar data, similar techniques. We're just adding a little more breakdowns to it. So it's going to look very much the same, but just with we have that breakdown now. And then we can get into the outfield. So we have Tommy Pham in left leading the way, Lorenzo Cain and Byron Buxton in center, and then Mookie Betts in right, doubling up the next guy, which is Mookie Betts is obviously well renowned for his defense, but even being that far ahead of everyone else is kind of a surprise, I guess. No, and Lorenzo Cain and Byron Buxton in center are also significantly ahead of their competition, which might seem a little off, but we know that we can look at Kiermaier and Engel both did not play full seasons last year, so we can know that if we look at their range on a rate basis, they're actually a lot closer to each other, so it's not like they're way ahead of the pack or anything. It's very bunched together near the top. So I guess one of the more interesting things we can look at in using from this system is the differences between this one and the existing system that you can see on Fangraphs and Baseball Reference and such. So Tim Anderson in that existing system is at -5 runs saved in this component of DRS, and in part he's -22, which not what you want to see. You want those numbers to be close together, but in reality they are pretty close together. It's just that because we're using these new techniques, we're adding some things into the consideration and removing some. The differences are more explainable than you would think just by those 17 run save difference. And so as an example of that, Tim Anderson saved 4 runs with his positioning in 2017, which aren't counted in his part, but are counted in the range and positioning. So if you were to add that to the part run saved, you get to -18. It's only a 13 run difference. And then if you add back in the shifts run save, so part is now including the run saved he gained or lost on the shifts, while the range and positioning run saved is not. So if you add that back in, you get -5 versus -11, and it's a lot closer than the initial numbers would have you believe, where the rest of the difference can be essentially attributed to just using a new and improved system for the calculation. Another player who featured a similar difference is Kyle Seager, who had a 10-run difference between the two systems. Again, very explainable, that he had 11 explainable runs of difference, so it's really just a 1-run difference between the two systems. And it's, like I said, it's we feel more confident in these results now using this new system. And speaking of Seager, we can see where he ranks on the third base leaderboard. For the past 3 years, he wasn't on the 2017 one, but you can see he's here. And I bring him up because of his unique breakdown, where he was 29 runs above average over the past 3 seasons just with his arm, while he was negative with his range, which no other of the top infielders featured that kind of breakdown. So it's just interesting that, like I said, we have this data now and we're able to break this down, and it's certainly interesting to know who's doing what well in terms of evaluating how they're useful to their teams. And then I'll just summarize, because I'm sure I'm getting toward the end. So the advantages of this system is that the biggest one, obviously, is that we can separate out positioning and range, which was not always possible, but now that we have that starter positioning data, infield starting positioning data, we're able to do so, and then we're also able to split out throwing and their contributions on airballs. The other big advantage of the system is that we can consider all plays. So before we were throwing out the shift plays, which, I mean, in recent years have become a significant percentage of all the plays that are going on in baseball. And now we can include those plays back in the system. And it's like, as you saw, those guys, Anderson and Seager, were -7 and Seager was 4 or 6 runs on shift. So those are not insignificant numbers. We also are able to handle the fielder overlap more appropriately. So because we have their starting positions, we know which fielders started to play more shallowly or deeper. So we can assume that the shallower fielders have a chance to make the play on the ball first. And in doing that, we can say even if the ball got past that shallower fielder, we can still debit him even if the play was made by someone behind him. And before, we didn't want to assume that in the other system, so we wouldn't be able to have that same kind of do that same kind of work. And then doing that fielder overlap, handling that more appropriately, allows us to sum up the individual fielders' run values and have that be closer to what the team's total credit should be on that play, which is one of the goals we set out to do when creating this system. So I just want to thank some people. So first of all, the Baseball Info Solutions video sketch for collecting all the data that allowed me to, well, not me, allowed us to create the system. Then John DeWan, obviously president and CEO of Baseball Info Solutions, and then Ben Jedlovic and Scott Spratt, both of whom have moved on from the company, but were significant in creating the framework for this system. My colleagues, Joe Rosales, Alex Vigderman, and Lindsay Zeck, and Mark Simon, I should add too, who have worked on the system more, in just as much or more than I have, and SABR for allowing me to present. So I guess if there's any questions, I can take them now. Thanks. And if there's no questions, I can just walk off the stage. All right.
Brian, what does the data show as to what teams do the best job of positioning?
So I don't have that data in front of me, but I do know the Cubs specifically, I remember, were pretty good at positioning their infielders at least, despite the fact that they weren't shifting a lot. But the other teams that were up north towards the top were like the heavy shifty teams. So the Astros, I believe, were near the top of that as well. But I don't remember the exact teams, and I don't have that in front of me. So with catchers, we also are able to do similar evaluations. The numbers are going to be a lot less extreme because of the fewer plays they make, but we're able to do everything the same way, where we group the batted balls based on their characteristics. And I should mention that this is only one of the 9 components of DRS. So we do have all those other like framing metrics part of DRS. We have stolen base run saved, strikes on run saved, bunt run saved, and those are all separate from what I've been talking about here. But this is the primary component of DRS essentially, and then we have all that other stuff for catchers as well. Does that make sense? I think Maldonado was top last year.
Hey, Brian. Hey. You touched on this a little bit during the presentation regarding positioning. Mm-hmm. So I think Addison Russell, you said, was +7 for positioning. So if someone makes the argument that's more of the team function, that they shift well rather than the individual skill level, how would you respond to that? Say it another way: if Addison Russell got traded to a team that doesn't shift as well or as effectively as the Cubs do, would his value go down? Well,
I mean, so that's why, as I kind of mentioned, we're not including positioning run saved in his DRS total. So we separate it out, and I can bring this back up. So we have it here. We have the 10 art run save that you see is just the sum of the -1, the 8, and the 3. So we record his positioning, but we don't count it towards his total. So that's, in that sense, if he was traded to a different team, we would only essentially consider his air range and throwing, because that's what we would probably transfer over. And in positioning, we aggregate on a team level because of that, because it is more of a team or coaching decision.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah.
Are you expecting your client teams to use some of the positioning data to evaluate how effective their shifting is?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I'm sorry. And do you see very often the reversal, like you saw with Lorenzo Cain and the other outfielder, where they were best in positioning, worst in range, reversed?
So sometimes, I mean, that's certainly not something that is universal. It does, I mean, if you're worse at positioning, you have more opportunity to be good at range, which is certainly something that we found. But there are plenty of guys who are above average in both or below average in both. And it's not necessarily this, I don't know if there's a trend in that. I think it's more just depending on how the teams are doing that positioning. All right. Nope. Okay.
So if we have a shortstop, if we have a third baseman like Manny Machado, and he allows, with his range, he allows the shortstop to play more up the middle, and let's say the shortstop up the middle is able to get to a ball that other shortstops don't because of Manny Machado, how do we reward Manny Machado for the play that the shortstop just made?
So that's a good question. I'm not sure if we're able to do that directly right now, or at least if we are doing it directly right now. Of course, I mean, certainly we'll be rewarding the shortstop, and you'll see that in the team run save totals. We'll show reference to that. But I don't know if we have a way right now to show Machado's impact on having other players be able to position differently.